I'm one of the clinical supervisors here. I've been here since before there were patients, so it's been more than a year. Before that, I worked at San Diego Family Care, working with a lot of immigrants in the city and in the Vista, so got a lot of exposure to trauma there. And I worked at JSS, Family Services. I have not been that much trauma doing that. I had training through Rady Hospital and the Chadwick Center in PFCBT, working with kids, treating kids with trauma. It was actually a study. They showed when we had these lots of measures to show that the kids are progressing. They wanted to see that kids who get PFCBT get better. I was through, it was a collaboration between Rady and basically CPS. So I was on the term team, and I would get referrals of kids who were abused, and with the pictures that the social workers took at the house or at the time of removal. So I will talk towards the end a little bit about so we're going to talk about trauma today. It's not the funnest topic, but it's definitely fascinating. I'm planning to have a little bit of time at the end for questions, but feel free as we go to ask questions or comments. We're kind of probably going to have lots of examples to share here. So we'll talk a little bit about the technical aspect of what we consider to be PTSD, changes in the recent DSM from the previous DSM. We'll talk. I thought when I proposed to make this presentation, I thought that we'll just go into the neuropsych of it, and that would be awesome. But then I started kind of putting it together, and it's just too much. The neuropsych is just super complex, which is why, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The changes in the DSM have to do also with the fact that it's a very complex condition. So we'll just touch on the neurological aspect. I want more to talk about adolescents, which I found as I was doing research for this presentation. It's really hard to find specific information on adolescents. There's a lot of information on children, on young children, early intervention, how trauma in infancy, all the first 5 kind of orientation. It's a big thing now in neurology. We want to intervene before age 5 because then the brain becomes the plasticity goes down. I feel that adolescents are a little left in the dark, so I'll try to shed as much light as we can, and we'll talk about what we see here. We definitely have our work here. We learn a lot about adolescents experience PTSD. And then I'll talk a little bit about treatments. So, at the beginning I was told that you guys will have a quiz. So this is what you were supposed to know for the quiz. Maybe we'll do it together at the end. But we'll review the diagnostic criteria, some specific brain regions that are involved in PTSD, and modalities for treatment. So before the diagnostic criteria, just to give us a sense of how many kids we're talking about. See, this is the most updated info I was able to find. A survey from 2011, kids who were from the referrals that were made nationwide, not just California, but nationwide referrals to CPS. And from those referrals, the ones who were substantiated that there was evidence of the fact is probably that the kids were removed, so there had to be some kind of neglect or abuse. So 19%, I don't know if that's good news or bad news, only 90% of the reports were actually found to be significant. And we know that it's a gray area, things are not clear cut. Sometimes we wish kids were removed more, sometimes we wish maybe they wouldn't remove so quickly kids from their homes, because sometimes that causes trauma in and of itself. But 19% were substantiated, and from that pool of kids, it's interesting that most kids were actually neglected, right? There's been a decline. It used to be that physical and sexual abuse were the big causes for CPS intervention. That's not the case anymore. The thought is that reporting actually may have the fact that teachers have to report it, and doctors report it, and there's a lot more awareness. So now actually neglect is the thing that is more, CPS is more urgent thing for them to treat or to get involved in. So you see that the numbers here don't just add up to 100. I guess there's overlap. Kids can be sexually abused and neglected and physically abused. But these are roughly the numbers. So if you can do the math, out of we're talking about 20% out of 6 million kids. So that's a lot of kids who are being exposed to these kind of experiences. As far as adolescents, so they didn't ask here about neglect. This is a self-report survey with kids who are exactly our age range for this facility. So we don't know about any experiences of neglect here, but you see that a lot of kids experience or report having had traumatic experiences. Of course, there's a problem with the self-report here, but we'll assume. I think the questions were pretty specific, but we don't know exactly if they're reporting accurately or not. But witnessing violence, 22% experience physical assault, and 8% experience sexual assault. Again, these are big numbers. A lot of kids. This I just copied from the VA website. I thought this paragraph is just interesting. PTSD in adolescents, they begin to more closely resemble PTSD in adults, whatever that means. However, there are a few features that have been shown to differ, as discussed above. Children may engage in traumatic play following trauma, and adolescents are more likely to engage in traumatic reenactment, in which they incorporate aspects of the trauma into their daily life, and they might be also more aggressive. So I feel this is kind of the story of adolescents. They're not here and they're not quite there, and I feel that treatment-wise, we sometimes don't know, and we're not always. We don't have adequate tools to really help with the specific needs of kids. So we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about treatment. But adolescents are really unique. They're not quite kids, but they're not quite adults either. And it shows even diagnostically in terms of how an illness or if you want to think about this, a neurological condition or a mental health condition manifests itself. It is unique to adolescents, and yet there aren't a lot of descriptions more detailed than this as to how exactly it is. And in terms of the treatments, you'll see TFCBT is highly researched in kids. I didn't see any specific research on this kind of age range, 12 to 17. And we're finding, we'll talk about this when we talk about TFCBT. Okay, so now to our little Bible here. The DSM-5. So the big news in DSM-4 PTSD was an anxiety disorder. It was together with phobias, with OCD was also an anxiety disorder. That's no longer the case. PTSD has its own chapter. So I guess that's a promotion for PTSD. I think it's an important acknowledgement that this is not just somebody who can't get over something that happened. This is a unique condition that is different from generalized anxiety and from other conditions, and needs specific kinds of intervention. Part of the reason it was removed is because of in what we know from neurology is that it really looks different. There are a lot of different brain regions. When we get to that, we'll talk about that a little bit. The anxiety piece is there, but there are also other things that are unique to PTSD, and treating it just as an anxiety disorder usually doesn't work. You just try to teach somebody to use coping skills to calm down. That's usually how we start treating PTSD, but that is not sufficient. So that's reflected in the DSM now. It's its own thing. In terms of the DSM, adolescents do not get any special criteria. Young children do in terms of how the diagnosis is manifested. So, like the quote before said, kids will play. They might not. That's a good way for a child to express, to show what's going on. They'll do that in their play, in drawings, and things like that. Adolescents are less likely to do that. And I think we see here how adolescents get engaged in activities that are very risky, very dangerous, enacting, or at least making sure that their level of anxiety remains the same, kind of perpetuating the situation. There used to be a criteria where there was a requirement in the DSM-4 for the person to have experienced in the moment, have perceived the experience as life-threatening or being very distressed. Who did that exclude then from developing PTSD? Random question. So it excluded first responders. So, right, firefighters, policemen, medics show up at a scene. They keep their cool. They do what they need to do. They go home and they have nightmares and they're having difficulty functioning. 9/11 or things that are maybe of a lesser magnitude, but still the reactions can be there. But based on the old criteria, that they could not be diagnosed with PTSD because they kept their cool and there was no distress. So that was removed. So who else in this room was excluded from this criteria? We were, right? A close friend of mine did her dissertation, I don't want to say how many years ago, on secondary trauma of therapists. And she, who worked with survivors of torture. And she got in touch with survivors of torture, and they gave her the list of therapists that they worked with, and she interviewed them. I think she actually measured their symptoms. It's not pretty. We can get secondary trauma. So we'll see in the criteria. You cannot get the diagnosis of PTSD if you got the information from the TV. So all of us were a little traumatized now by the shooting. We need to find another way to express that. But if you're hearing this from, and you might not, even therapists might not qualify for a per se PTSD diagnosis, but some of the symptoms and some of the reactions might be similar just by hearing somebody, working with somebody who's been tortured repeatedly can be very, very disturbing and very difficult to kind of digest and let go of. So that's how we got also into DSM. Yeah. So let's go into more details. So it's one of these weird things in mental health diagnoses that the part of the criteria is something that is really not medical. Right, and that's another thing about the diagnosis, the changes in the DSM to this diagnosis and other diagnoses. Finally, psychiatrists are able to find physiological markers of mental illnesses, right? And that's why they were so happy to make these changes. Or I'm exaggerating. These are all things that are debated, and they're sometimes controversial. But it's my impression that a lot of psychiatrists are very happy that finally they can say, listen, this illness, it's not just based on what you're telling me, it's not just based on clinical impressions, it's not like Freud days, you know, we have physiological proof that these things are happening. We're still not at a place where we can diagnose based on these things, right? Does anybody know, is there any, which is the mental illness that you can, that has a physiological marker? That to diagnose it, you have to have some kind of test, right? Because it's really weird. There aren't very many. To my knowledge, there's just one. There's a sleeping disorder that to diagnose it, you need hormone levels to prove, and that's how you can diagnose that sleeping disorder. All other disorders, including schizophrenia, which is highly researched, and we know a lot about the brain, still we don't have a physiological marker for it. Neither for bipolar, even for autism, which is a neurological condition, for sure. That's not how you diagnose it. They still need us. That's the good news. They still need us. We still need diagnostic skills. We still need interview skills. We still need background and information in order to give a diagnosis. We can't just put you in an MRI and say, okay, this is what you're. But it might be that, I don't know, DSM-10 might be a lot more neurologically based, and maybe there will be pictures of what, you know, this is what the kind of blue and green and yellow lights that a brain looks like when you have schizophrenia or whatnot, and things will look different than how we work now. But I'm not going to worry about it. I don't see it. We don't know what psychologists will do in 50 years or so. So you need to have had an experience that is life. So if you spilled your, I spilled my Starbucks in the car, and I was like, oh my God, I'm traumatized, right? No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things in a little bit of a different magnitude. And then the question, so did everybody who witnessed 9/11 live, not on TV, what's the percentage of people who develop PTSD after witnessing something like this? Any guesses?
45%.
Okay. Going once? 15. 10. Okay. Well, if you look in the research, you'll get all those numbers. It seems like the average is in the between 30 and 40%. This is for adults. I've been finding information. This is really hard to assess in children, right? No, actually, it seems that children are actually more resilient, maybe because they don't get it sometimes, or maybe because their brain grows fast and they're able to, grow out of it. So in children, I don't know the numbers, but there's less actually PTSD compared to adults. In adults, it seems like the average of developing PTSD after witnessing a traumatic event seems to be in the 30s. My guess would be that it might be different if you're in the military, you're in a war zone compared to car accidents. And we'll talk about the different trauma. Is not just this one thing. It depends if you were abused for years and years and years, or there was one incident that you were exposed to. All these things have a big impact on how PTSD develops. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so there's the exposure. Sexual violence was added specifically in DSM-5 to make clear that it was not present in DSM-4. And then there are 4 domains of symptoms. So let's go over them quickly so we can get to the real stuff, which is the treatment. So intrusion symptoms, what would that be? What else? Flashbacks. So we have here a lot. Kids say, oh, I have flashbacks. They say that all the time. And we sometimes have to dig in a little bit. Do you mean you remember this sometime? Or are those flashbacks? So what distinguishes flashbacks from memory? It could be, so in the case of dissociation, right? You're re-experiencing the trauma, and there's a detachment from sensory input. And you see that we're going into the neurology now, right? It's a really different kind of remembering, right? We usually don't do this. We need to be, taking something to be able to experience a memory so vividly and so, but it happens very naturally sometimes. The folks who have PTSD. So, but a flashback can be re-experiencing, but it doesn't need to be. That's a very extreme form of flashback. What would be a lesser form of flashback?
Unwanted, distressing thoughts.
Right. You're trying to do your job, and suddenly you have these images flying, or you have this memory, but you're reacting so strong that it kind of takes you away from what you're doing. You're maybe not screaming and shouting. You're not reliving it, but still, it's disrupting your stream of thought, right? So so nightmares, flashbacks. What else? Kind of touched on another one. So dissociation is its own thing. You can dissociate without having flashbacks, right? What would that look like? What have you guys seen?
Sounds?
No, that's dissociation is not a sensory experience. Sounds, there can be sometimes the re-experiencing can have can look like a hallucination. And then you might be hearing, you hear a sound, nobody else heard it. It might not be a hallucination. It's kind of this strong memory that comes back. But dissociation is a little different.
I have a question. What about people that do blackout drinking? Could that be considered like a self-dissociation?
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we talk about comorbidity, definitely. So dissociation doesn't always happen in PTSD. You can dissociate in all kinds of ways. So that's a drug-induced dissociation, right? I don't want to think about it. I don't want to feel it. I'm going to get drunk. But what would it look like if it's not drug-induced? What would it look like?
Like a spacing out.
Spacing out, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're talking, going back and forth, looking at each other, and suddenly the person is somewhere else. So you might want to ask if they're hearing voices. What just happened? Are they listening to an internal stimuli, and that we're not in the PTSD realm anymore? We're starting to look at other things. Or, and maybe they can't explain, right? It might be just this numbness. This topic came up, and I'm gone. And the person may or may not be aware of what happened, so it can be very subtle. What's the extreme form of dissociation?
Depersonalization.
Okay, but when does it become its own diagnosis? Dissociation.
Different identities.
Yeah, split. It's not called split personality, right? The thing that usually people think schizophrenia is, but it's not. And this is usually connected to trauma. So kids, when there's prolonged trauma and things really, really awful happen, kids have the ability to dissociate in the moment, and sometimes that dissociation grows into really split networks in the brain that make up into two personalities that they may or may not be aware of. So we'll see that there are several disorders that are kind of tied to trauma. Dissociative disorder. Many people think that most people who end up with a borderline personality disorder, at the bottom of it there's a trauma, and that they just became used to surviving in that mode, and it became a personality that we label as a borderline personality disorder. Okay, so we covered intrusion symptom. Avoidance, what would that look like? Right, not wanting to talk about it. You're sitting with them in the office. So what happened? Nothing.
And I I kind of experienced it, kind of a mix between avoiding and like the dissociative and stuff, where like we're talking about like topic, and then all of a sudden like the client kind of, what are you talking? What's going on? Like it's like
disruption in the
they
in the stream of
completely
thought.
dysregulated, yeah.
Like not going to certain places or avoiding people.
Right, the more behavioral stuff. I had a kid, I treated a kid, she was in a car accident, she wouldn't get into the car. She was too scared to get into a car. Very logical, if you think about it. So kind of behavioral avoidance, not going to places, not going to a certain place, not using certain words. It can have all kinds of different manifestations. And in treatment, it makes it difficult, right? We have kids, we know that awful things happen, they don't want to talk about them, and we work with that, right? We'll talk about the treatment, we definitely don't want. We'll work with parents. Sometimes parents will come to you and say, they have something, they need to talk about it, with this idea that therapy is cathartic, and we need to talk about it, and then things get better. And that's true for some things, not for trauma usually. For trauma, you need a little more prepping, and you need we need to think about more things than just spilling it out. Negative alterations of cognition and mood. What might that look like?
I have an inability to experience joy or satisfaction.
Kind of trapped in this. Irritable. It can be really aggressive. And in terms of cognition, sometimes kind of a very rigid, kind of just focusing on one thing and not wanting to, it can, I mean, some of these things are also present, for example, in depression, right? When you're depressed, you don't want to deal with things, or everything is irritating, you don't remember very well. So these things overlap, and you can be depressed many times, folks with PTSD. It's exhausting. They come to a point where they don't have the energy to deal, and they get very despaired. Usually we want to know that this is related to the trauma. We want to see if there's a decline from the time of the trauma, or there's a shift as far as that goes. Okay, and the last domain is this is the anxiety part. You're on fight or flight. In trauma, you're living fight or flight all the time, which was adaptive probably at some point, but it becomes it's not adaptive anymore. It's usually destructive and not helpful. This is what's causing sleep problems. This is what's causing startle responses. Right? The body, and we'll get to the neurology of this. The body remains in fight or flight, even though there isn't a danger present. And there's a learning problem here, right? We'll talk about that. The duration needs to be more than 1 month. The disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment, and the disturbance is not due to alcohol. So, folks with post-trauma may develop an addiction. This happens all the time. It's very common. But we would want to see these symptoms even after a while of sobriety. We will have to tease these things out. Any questions on diagnostics? PTSD is more prevalent in females than it is in males. I haven't found an explanation, but that's a statistical fact. It does not seem to be for schizophrenia across cultures, across continents, across countries. Schizophrenia is prevalent in 1% of the population, and we know the genes and all of that good stuff. PTSD is not like that because it's somewhere between. There's a strong factor of how you deal with things. So it seems like in other cultures there might be either outlets for it, or people are able to heal in different ways, maybe because of cultural, because of the way maybe the event is structured or the way people interact. but it is not prevalent across cultures the same way it is in this country. So, okay. So how is it different in children? The biggest difference that is not on this slide, because it will be in the next few slides, is that PTSD in children, you get that presentation that we talked about, but you're also in the course of development, of brain development. So the assumption is that if you're an adult, you experience a traumatic event, your brain changes, your brain starts working in a different way than it did before, and we have to deal with that. In children and adolescents, it's the same thing, but it's a moving car. You know, the car is moving, it's not just moving, it's growing, right? So this whole process of brain development and how, but not just in terms of the brain, also in terms of things that we can experience, identity development, social skills, learning. Learning is high, like I mentioned, you don't learn well when you're on PTSD. Well, when you're an adult, you're not learning how to adjust. But when you're a kid, you're not learning a million things. You're not learning academically, you're not learning social skills, you're not learning who you are, you're not learning relationships. So the damage is actually a lot bigger on some level. I mean, you can't really quantify these things, but it's just more complex, and we'll talk about how these things play out. In terms clinically, it's hard to, there are treatment challenges because kids don't report. This is true for most mental health illnesses. The younger the kids are, but we see this here too. Kids who something about their internal life, and they're just not. They really don't have the works, and so it makes treatment a little more complicated or more challenging, whatever you want to think about it. As far as the DSM goes, the cutoff is 6. So the criteria are slightly different for children who are 6 or younger. But it's really mostly not in terms of how they present it. So kids will be acting out in ways that, when they're adolescents, we don't call it acting out anymore. But I do, because really it's not very different. So I feel some of these criteria are a little, or the cutoff is a little arbitrary. I'm not sure how they came up. I'm guessing that it has to do with brain development. There's a convention in San Diego every year that the county does with RAID. We can't wait, right? We can't wait. Early intervention, 0 to 5, everything. If we can get to kids before they're 5, they'll be fine. And then we forget about all the other kids. So I'm guessing that that's how 6 came to be. So again, the DSM spells out developmental regression as something that happens in kids. I would say that it happens definitely in adolescents. So all the time, I mean, we have discussions here all the time. Well, we have a 17-year-old, but how are they acting? Oh, they feel like they're 10. They haven't, because of trauma, because of mental illness, they haven't done things that teenagers do. They haven't learned much about dating, about their place in society. They think we had a kid. I don't remember that he had that much trauma. But anyways, he was 17. What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to make. He wanted to be an artist that makes. It sounded to me almost like Play-Doh. He wanted just to make things out of clay. Something not connected to anything, not something he does on a regular basis. Just this kind of idea that's very detached from any real life experiences. So it's true for children with PTSD. It's true, I think, for children with any kind of developmental or even medical problem that kind of comes in the way of them experiencing life the way a kid that doesn't have those things. Any questions? Okay, so we'll do our little neurological excursion. So I didn't feel I had time for this here, but the interns here have seen, you can find on YouTube awesome videos that show real brains, like not these pretty, colorful renditions, but just the real goo that it is. It's really fun. It's really, you should look it up. It's really bizarre that such a gooey part of the body can do such amazing things. I'm serious. I mean, think about it.
Have you touched one? You said it's really.
I have not.
It just looks cool.
Just skulls. Only skulls. I don't deal with things that are not wrapped. But many, I think all medical traditions in the world, Greek medicine, Chinese medicine, the Chinese, they figured out a lot of things. They did surgeries in China. Chinese medicine is very aware of internal organs and all of that. But none of the ancient medicine traditions attributed any importance to the brain. I'm sure, I mean, people eat brains, right? They knew that brains existed. But none of the traditions that I'm aware of thought that it was very important. So thought, you know, love is in the heart, and the Bible wisdom is considered to be in the heart. The kidney, you know, in Chinese medicine, the liver holds the anger. All of the things that now we look in the brain to find explanations for were attributed to other parts of the body. And it makes sense, because when you look at the brain, all you see is goo. It's really not very, or you can't, you can't figure out just from looking. You know, you look at a stomach, there's some physiological sense. You can see that it's a tube. You can figure out what it might be doing. Not so for the brain, or to a very limited extent. But now we have technologies, and we have ways to figure this out a little more. So the first part here, this part down here, is the anxiety piece of PTSD, because the amygdala is overreacting on a permanent basis. It stays very reactive. The forebrain that is supposed to regulate the amygdala is not connecting. So there's a disconnect happening between the frontal lobe is our logical part, right? So if we hear a bang on the door, right, we're all going to maybe get a little startled. We'll start to try and figure out what it is. So that means that the amygdala sends, before we even try to think what that was, this is in normal. This is for all of us. Not normal. Normal is on the washing machine. Normal is a washing machine thing. Yeah, no. But in typical brain functioning, the amygdala will already send signals to your body to freak out. Right? That's how we work. That's how we used to survive when we lived in environments a little less structured. So, and then it sends messages to our forebrain, and then we start thinking. What was it? Do I need to run? Is it okay? Oh, it was just somebody just shut the door. Okay. And somebody just shut the door, so I can calm down, and the frontal lobe will calm us down, and the signals will go to the parasympathetic parts of nervous system in the body, and we'll calm down. So that's part of the presentation. In PTSD, this part is no longer talking very strongly to the amygdala. So the frontal lobe is no longer able to overcome this reaction, and this reaction kind of becomes permanent. The amygdala is stressed out all the time, and it doesn't listen to reason on some level. And that's where the learning part goes. So when there's a process where the brain, again, the brain is amazing. I mean, it's the most, scientists, I keep seeing videos about brain neurology, it's the most complex object known to us in terms of the complexity. We're talking about billions of neurons that are connected in ways that we still don't know. There are projects now in this country and in Europe to really try and map, to figure out. These are brain regions, but they're connected in billions of ways, and you can't track it because it's so small. So they're mapping now the brain a little bit like they did the genome. It's going to probably be a little different because brains are not the same. All our brains are not connected exactly the same. But broadly speaking, there's a learning process here where after we learn that the door was shut, that information gets processed and we have that as a memory maybe. Yeah, remember that day that boring guy was talking about all these traumatic things and then the door slammed and we got really scared. But it was nothing and, and that was that. So we learned something and we might have a memory of that. So that goes through the hippocampus, the thalamus is involved in that. All of that processing of information does not really occur when you have PT, or it depends if you think it's the chicken or the egg. You can say that is what PTSD is. When your brain functions like that, when you're so stressed out, so we are starting from talking about a stress response, but when you are so stressed, and for a very long time, and your brain stops processing information appropriately, and your amygdala becomes dysregulated to the point where you're all the time in fight or flight, that is what PTSD is. And maybe one day there will be they'll put you in an MRI machine, and that's how they'll decide if you have it or not. But we're not quite there yet. So the learning problem here is that, right, we have veterans coming from Afghanistan, from Iraq. They know very well that they're not in a war zone anymore. They're aware that they're not psychotic. They know where they are. If you ask them who's the president, they will know who the president is and what time it is. And yet, that information that is coming from here is not impacting their level of anxiety. And they keep reacting and on some level, and re-experiencing trauma, the memories that they have, and those memories are not impacted by other information. So this has genetic implications. There's evidence that there are changes in how the genes express themselves. There are changes in the kind of receptors that the brain, that nerves in the brain have. So nerves become less sensitive to certain neurotransmitters. A lot of changes happen. Again, that's why we're thinking, the thought is that PTSD is really a distinct condition. Your body is very different. Your brain, your nervous system are functioning in a way that is distinct from any other situation, and it more than just, oh, you're anxious. It's not just the fight or flight. It's not just your sympathetic and parasympathetic system. It's a more global and more debilitating, right? My family anxiety is that's what we do for breakfast. But we can go to school, and for many of us who have gone through grad school, anxiety is a helper. Oh God, I have a test tomorrow. That's what gets you to sit and study, right? Here we're talking about more chronic. Even though this can happen from just one event. So sometimes it's chronic, sometimes it's just the strength of the impact, but it creates changes in the brain that are very distinct. Any thoughts or comments in trying to see if I can answer your questions, but I'm not confident as far as neuropsychology. On time, all right. So here's the piece. This is where child development comes into play. So I borrowed a slide from Dr. Bruce Perry, who was in town in the last We Can't Wait conference. He's the big guru of studying trauma in children. You can find his presentation on YouTube. Yeah, the website is childrentrauma.org. He really wants to educate people about what trauma is. So I just picked this one. So without going, again, the whole neuropsych is difficult, and even understanding how scientists come up with the conclusions they come up with is very complicated and difficult. But in a nutshell, what Dr. Perry is saying is that he's talking about the brain. These different regions that we talked about, he stacks them up to make it more simple in a kind of an evolutionary way. So this is the brain stem, the midbrain. This is the limbic system. So we're thinking. So when I talked about the amygdala, the anxiety reaction, it lives here, and this is the cortex, the rational part, or the executive part of the brain. And they develop what he's saying. His treatment for PTSD is called neurological sequencing. What he discovered, or what he said, what he talked about, is that they develop one on top of the other. So by the time you're a year old, your brain stem is pretty much developed. That's the part that regulates our breath, our heart rates, all the things we don't need to think about. Temperature, that all happens here. If you had trauma when this was developing, needless to say, this and this and this will not develop the way it should, because the basics weren't laid out well. The foundation wasn't laid out well. So these cannot grow as they should have. So this is the proportion, and this is just a scheme. It's not just to give us a visual idea. This is how it should look. A mature brain should look if it developed without too many stressors. You see, here these are smaller. This is underdeveloped because this was the nerves here didn't have a chance to kind of grow the way they should because of stress, because of trauma, because of malnutrition, of many things, or neglect. So we're starting to see deficits up here, and these deficits won't go away just because we want them to. And we need to be aware of these things. And in his treatment modality, he will assign different tasks to try and make up for missed neurological milestones that may not have to do directly with talking about the trauma or kind of the cognitive stuff that we're talking about. Tell me about what happened, how do you feel about it? But with really more basic stuff, if a child didn't have a chance to crawl when they were 3 because they were locked in his book. His book is called The Child Who Was Raised as a Dog, right? That's the name of the book, and one of the stories in the book was about a kid who was raised as a dog. He was left, his parents, I forget the detail, he was left with a person who had dogs and didn't know how to raise children. So he just put him with the dogs in cages. That's how he grew up. So he didn't learn. So that, of course, he didn't learn social skills. He didn't. I think he didn't learn to talk. But even more basic things, right? So this is the part of the brain that we're aware of. This is, this is what we're aware of. These are our thoughts and our self. Things that we can regulate and think about. But these are things that we don't really have. They just happen in our bodies. Our brain is in charge, but unless you're a yogi and you meditate 17 hours a day, and you can change your, pancreas, yogis can do that. They can get in tune and they can regulate body functions that most of us can't. So if these don't develop right, of course, and the limbic system is what we call emotional regulation, and a lot of mental health has to do with the relationship between these two parts of our brain. So that's why childhood trauma is considered even more complicated than adult trauma, because not only are you talking about disruptions in brain function in a way that is, that's hardware. Your hardware is changing now. Our brains are different from computers in that they can change back and forth, but still in children, there's also the impact on the future of the development that is in progress. And, so that's the development in a nutshell. talk about that more. So we talked about the brain kind of as a machine, but we know that trauma has impact on development as far as things that we can experience. And the kind of trauma will, like other disorders, the DSM now is moving into into thinking about things as spectrum, right? Because the brain is so complex and we're all different. If we looked into all the connections, some of us are great in music, and some of us are great in math, and some of us learn languages easily. We're definitely not all wired the same, even though we have the basic same brain structure. So similarly, if you have a traumatic event, if something goes very badly early on, it's going to affect everybody a little different. But also the kind of stressor. We're talking, trauma is really an extreme stressor. And the kind of stressor will also determine what kind of outcome it might have. So frequency, was your stress system overloaded once because you were on Wall Street when the Twin Towers were hit? That's the actual event happened in the course of the day, or were you abused daily? Were you tortured for years in a dungeon somewhere? That changes the kind of trauma or the kind of symptoms that you'll experience will be different. So the frequency, the duration. In children, it's, again, because we're talking about development, the relationship the child had with the abuser or the perpetrator is very important. If it's a stranger, it might have a lesser actual impact than if it was, and usually it's not. Most sexual abuse cases happen to kids with people that they know and that they usually trust. So that will also change. That also impacts how a child will react to adverse experience. Whether there was force used, if the trauma was, again, because this changes the quality of the relationship. Car accident is one thing, but if somebody hits you or forces you to do things, or physically causes you pain, intentionally causes you physical pain, those are all different scenarios, and that will have a different impact on how this child perceives adults or parenting relationships or love, right? Because if a child is abused by the person who's supposed to care for them, their whole perception of what care is and what love is and what a relationship is going to be impacted by that experience. And you can see how that, right, we're in the first module in DBT is interpersonal relationships, right? That gets very skewed if we want to think of borderline personality as a result of early trauma. So relationships are going to, almost by definition, are going to be harmed if the trauma was caused by a parent figure, by a caregiver. And of course, were there multiple traumas, like if a kid is maltreated at home, but they also bullied at school? If a child is being sexually abused repeatedly, were they also maltreated by in other situations in their lives? You see that it's kind of how much badness this child has experienced is going to affect presentation. Are they able? Some kids are still able to somehow function in school. Sometimes it's a refuge. Let's just, I'll just do math and forget about everything else. And if they have that strength, it can be very helpful for them. But at a certain point, there's a point where the kid can't. I can't deal anymore. They shut down. School goes south. Of course, the individual factors again, not 100% of people or kids exposed to trauma develop PTSD. So obviously there are differences in the kids, in the kids, not just in the kind of trauma. So the age, again, we're thinking that the younger, well, before 5, we thought is that it's still maybe there's a lot more hope. At least, when I hear about, for example, adoption, we have kids who are adopted. I always want to know what age were they adopted, assuming that adoption happened around something didn't go well in the original family. If it happened, if those things happened before age 5, and if the attachment started developing with the adopting parent before age 5, each case is different, but my thought would be, yay. And if things happen after that age, they seem to be a lot more difficult. Gender, I mentioned that. Temperament, some kids are just, they're just not emotionally as reactive as others. I have 2 kids. My daughter is way more emotionally reactive than my son. Why? I don't know. They have the same genetic makeup. But temperament and how kids handle things are just can be different and can determine how they cope with a very extreme stressor. So I'm saying we have only 5 more minutes. Alright, so I'm going to let you, I think this kind of makes sense, right? Family stressors, family is resilient, if there's more stressors at home, and if there's more support or less support, all these kinds of things are going to determine how a child copes with an extreme stress. I wanted us to focus on a little bit on adolescence still. So I found some, there are different ways to think about what the developmental challenges are for teenagers. Here are 2 examples. You'll see that there's some overlap here. Of course, sexuality is introduced in adolescence. It's a challenge. We have kids here identifying as anything and everything. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around pansexuality versus bisexuality versus, right? And kids these days actually are given an opportunity to kind of play with these things, really check what they like, what they don't like, what works for them in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation. It's a very important milestone. Of course, if you're dealing with a college parent, you won't have a lot of resources to think about this, or to kind of go out with your peers and really focus on that. You're going to be worried about other things, and your energy is going to be put into more survival kind of things. You don't know what's going to happen when you get home, or you don't know what's going to happen at any given moment. Teenagers start learning about, start having the capacity to think about future and past in ways that little kids can't. So my kids are 5 and 6. If something is happening not today, it's happening tomorrow. Tomorrow can be tomorrow, it could be next week, it could be next month. When is Santa coming? Tomorrow. And they're usually happy with that answer. And it works for, now they can count a little more, so sometimes like a week before we can start breaking it down into, okay, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. But the future is completely obscure to them. They cannot, we told my son when he watches cartoons, he gets really hyper and starts hitting other kids. So we don't let him watch Ninja Turtles. We told him, when you're 17, you can watch Ninja Turtles. So now he'll come to me and say, when I'm 17, can I get that toy? You know what? Good deal. Even when you're 16, I'm large with him. Right? When you're a teenager, you start getting your brain can process. It's not that kids are stupid. Their brains, there are parts of the brain that manage time and abstract and all of those things. And the frontal lobe matures in the teenage years, and that's when they can start figuring out these things. Again, if a teenager is preoccupied with other stuff, with other stressors, with memories that are just debilitating, they won't get to think about this. So we have a kid here now, and again, this doesn't always happen just because of trauma, but he dropped out of, he hasn't been in school in high school for 6 months, he's 17, but he thought he could still graduate. So there was a disconnect between reality and he wasn't aware, and it took just one session with some therapists to kind of, it's going to be a GED, it's not going to be a school diploma. And he got it. He's not a stupid kid, but nobody sat down with him to think about this. So that's also a developmental kind of challenge. And all of these things get disrupted. And on top of this, many kids who are teenagers now, their trauma maybe didn't start yesterday. They could have been traumatized years ago, or maybe they've been constantly traumatized. There are all these permutations. So if you superimpose early childhood trauma on a teenager, now you can get all kinds of gaps in development in terms of knowing who you are, knowing to relate to others. We're having kids who are 16 and 17 and they sit with a therapist and they don't know what to do with that. They don't know that you can talk to somebody and resolve problems or just all of this is really important. Some of the interns here have been traumatized by my presentation on trauma, where we analyze the story of Peter Rabbit. I put the picture here because I think if you're familiar with the story, you can go to Costco, you can get all the books now. I think it's a big pack of books. To me, that's a story about a traumatized kid. I won't go into this now. But it can look very benign. It can look like, and that's usually more for little kids. Once they get teenagers, it stops because now they can act out on more adult stuff and it becomes more dangerous and everybody's paying attention. Peter Rabbit is able to do these mischievous kids. It's kind of half play, so it can look kind of not so alarming, or kind of maybe, it's boys will be boys kind of thing. And sometimes it's not. It's really something that needs to be addressed. I don't know, we ran out of time. These are the medications that are used because of the complex brain presentation of trauma. There isn't one drug for no illness, really. There's just one drug because the brain is so complex. But these are the drugs that are often used, and these are the treatments that are often used. I'll talk about that another time. If you Google trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, there's training online, 30 hours of training. You can get a certificate. It has videos, it has handouts. It's a really good training. So you can learn about the basics of trauma-focused therapy. And it's free. That's it.